The courtroom was unusually crowded that morning. It wasn't just lawyers, clerks, and officers taking their usual seats. Curious townspeople, journalists with notepads in hand, and even a few students from the local college had filled the benches, eager to witness what everyone had been whispering about for weeks. At the center of the storm was a trial that had divided the community. The crime itself had shaken the town, but what truly drew so much attention was the fact that the prosecution's star witness wasn't a seasoned detective, an expert analyst, or even an adult. It was a child, a little girl, barely 3 years old. Her name was Lily Harper. She was a shy, tiny figure with big brown eyes that seemed to take in more of the world than anyone gave her credit for. She was still learning to form complete sentences, her words often coming out in fragments that only her mother or grandmother could fully understand. And yet, for reasons that baffled and unsettled many, she was about to take center stage in one of the most important cases the county courthouse had seen in years. When the bailiff opened the side door and Lily entered, clinging tightly to her mother's hand, the room grew quiet. Conversations that had buzzed moments earlier suddenly ceased. All eyes turned toward the small figure, dressed in a pale yellow dress that seemed too formal for someone who still played with dolls. Her shoes tapped lightly against the wooden floor, each sound echoing in the high-ceilinged chamber. To many, it was surreal. This was a courtroom, a place where facts were dissected and testimony scrutinized, where lives could be changed with a single verdict. And yet, into this intimidating space walked a toddler whose voice was soft, uncertain, and unpracticed. Sitting a few feet away was Rex. Rex was no ordinary dog. A large German shepherd with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. He was part of a growing program across the United States courtroom comfort dogs, trained to provide emotional support for vulnerable witnesses, especially children. His handler, Officer Daniels, sat nearby, keeping Rex at ease but ready. Children often felt intimidated in court, and the presence of a gentle, steady animal could make the difference between silence and a chance at truth. Today, everyone hoped Rex would work his quiet magic. The defendant, seated at the defense table, shifted uncomfortably when Lily entered. He was a man in his mid-30s, well known in town, and the accusation against him had rattled more than his reputation. He maintained his innocence. His lawyers insisted that the entire case was built on shaky ground, and they had been confident until the court allowed Lily's appearance. Now, for the first time, unease showed on his face. He stared down at the table, as though avoiding the sight of the child who could undo him. The judge, a silver-haired man with a reputation for being stern but fair, leaned forward on his bench. His expression softened slightly as he watched Lily climb into the oversized witness chair with the help of the bailiff. It was impossible not to see how small she was, how out of place she looked in a world built for adults. The judge cleared his throat, then spoke in a voice gentler than anyone had heard from him in years. "Hello, Lily," he said kindly. "Do you see that nice dog sitting near you? His name is Rex. He's here to be your friend." Lily's eyes darted toward Rex, who wagged his tail slightly, his head tilting as if acknowledging her presence. The little girl smiled faintly, her grip on her stuffed bunny loosening just a bit. The courtroom, tense only seconds before, seemed to exhale. The prosecutor rose carefully. He knew that one wrong move, one overly complicated question, could send the child retreating into silence. "Hi, Lily," he said softly, crouching a little to appear less intimidating. "Do you remember me? We met last week when we played with some blocks." Lily nodded, clutching her bunny tighter, but not looking away. Her mother, sitting only a few feet from her, gave a reassuring smile. The defense attorney rolled his eyes dramatically, leaning back in his chair. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he muttered under his breath. "We're seriously going to let a toddler, who can't even form proper sentences, decide the outcome of a trial. The judge lifted a hand to silence him. "You will have your chance, counselor. For now, remain quiet." The prosecutor continued, careful with every word. "Lily, can you tell us who Rex is?" She looked at the dog, then back at the prosecutor. Her voice was small, almost a whisper. "Doggy." A ripple of soft laughter spread through the gallery, quickly hushed by the bailiff. "That's right," the prosecutor said warmly. "He's a very good doggy, isn't he?" She nodded again, this time stroking Rex's ear as the dog leaned closer, offering comfort. The room sat on edge, the air heavy with anticipation. No one really believed Lily would say much. Many doubted she would speak at all. But the fact that she had already responded, that she had acknowledged Rex, was more progress than some had expected. The defendant avoided looking at her, his jaw tightening. His lawyer scribbled furiously on a notepad, already preparing objections. But the jury wasn't looking at him anymore. Their attention was on the child and the dog, on the fragile yet powerful possibility that truth could emerge from such innocence. Lily tilted her head, her eyes lingering on Rex for a long moment. Then she looked across the room, at the man seated at the defense table. She frowned slightly, her tiny brows knitting together. She didn't speak, not yet, but her expression alone made the jury lean forward. Something was happening. The judge, watching carefully, nodded to the prosecutor to proceed gently. Everyone knew the stakes. This wasn't just testimony. It was the delicate unraveling of a child's memory, carried on words she was barely learning to form. And in that quiet moment, when the room seemed to hold its breath, it became clear. Though she was the smallest person in the courtroom, Lily was about to become the most important voice of all. The truth was waiting fragile, hesitant, but ready to emerge from the mouth of a 3-year-old girl who barely knew how to talk. The town of Maplewood was not accustomed to headlines. Nestled between rolling hills and farmland, it was the sort of place where people left their doors unlocked, where the sound of church bells or a high school football game defined the rhythm of life. But all of that had changed the night of the incident. Since then, Maplewood had been consumed by one question. Could a man so familiar, so trusted in the community, really be guilty of what he was accused of? The accused, Thomas Greer, was a man with deep roots in the town. He had been a volunteer at local events, a neighbor many waved to from porches, someone whose reputation had seemed unshakable. When news broke that he was facing charges of assaulting a woman in his neighborhood, woman who was Lily's babysitter, the town's faith in him fractured. Some refused to believe it, clinging to the image of the man they thought they knew. Others, disturbed by whispers and rumors long ignored, weren't so quick to defend him. At the center of this divide was Lily. She had been there, in the house, the night of the incident. Too young to understand everything, yet too honest to fabricate what she had seen. She had been playing with her blocks when voices rose in anger, when something loud crashed, when her babysitter cried out. In the chaos, Lily had seen Greer. Her tiny brain, still learning the world, had locked the memory deep inside. But memory doesn't always follow the rules of language. And when asked weeks later what she saw, she had whispered 2 chilling words: "Bad man." The prosecution seized upon this. It wasn't much, but it was raw, unfiltered, and perhaps the only testimony untouched by motive. Children didn't lie in the way adults did. A 3-year-old wasn't calculating, wasn't tailoring words to fit an agenda. For the district attorney's office, Lily was not just a witness, she was the case's fragile heartbeat. The defense, however, scoffed. A toddler? Attorney Mark Willard had said in a press conference, his voice dripping with disdain. We are now relying on the babbling of a 3-year-old to determine guilt? This is not justice. This is desperation. His words struck a chord. Many in town nodded in agreement. Others, however, argued that innocence often spoke the clearest truth. As the trial began, this divide manifested everywhere in diners, in church pews, even in family kitchens. Some neighbors stopped speaking to each other. "He's innocent until proven guilty," one side insisted. "But she saw him," the other countered. A small town that once prided itself on harmony now found itself split in two. The media caught wind of the unusual case, and suddenly, Maplewood was no longer quiet. Local reporters camped outside the courthouse. Regional newspapers ran features with headlines like, "Toddler Witness to Take the Stand," and "Can a 3-year-old deliver justice?" Even television crews arrived, their bright lights turning the courthouse steps into a stage. Inside the courtroom, tension simmered. The prosecution prepared carefully, knowing the weight placed on the shoulders of someone who could barely reach the witness stand. They arranged for Rex, the police dog, to be present. They rehearsed simple interactions, tested ways to phrase questions, and reminded themselves that anything too complex would collapse the moment. The defense, meanwhile, sharpened its knives. Their strategy was clear: discredit Lily at all costs. They would argue that she was too young to distinguish reality from imagination. They would suggest her words were planted by adults, her mother, or even the prosecutors themselves. And they would emphasize how dangerous it was to let the future of a man's life hang on the scattered speech of a toddler. The judge, aware of the stakes, weighed each motion carefully. His decision to allow Lily's testimony had not been made lightly. He knew the defense's objections had merit. Children could be unreliable, their memories easily influenced. But he also knew that silencing her entirely risked erasing the only direct account of that night. In his chambers, late at night, he wrestled with the ethics. Justice wasn't about comfort. It was about truth, no matter how messy the path. On the second day of trial, as Lily was scheduled to appear, the courtroom buzzed with nervous energy. Families filled the benches, whispering their divided loyalties. One older woman clutched her Bible, shaking her head at the accused. Across the aisle, a man muttered angrily that this was nothing more than a witch hunt. Even before the trial reached its midpoint, the case had become less about facts and more about faith in the innocence of a child's words, or faith in the innocence of a man everyone thought they knew. When the prosecutor rose to address the jury before Lily's testimony, he spoke plainly. "Ladies and gentlemen, you will soon hear from our youngest witness. She is not polished. She will not sound like an adult. But in her few words, you may hear the purest account of what happened that night. Your task is not to dismiss her because of her age, but to weigh her truth as carefully as you would weigh anyone else's." The defense attorney smirked as he stood to respond. "A child's words are precious, yes. But children dream. Children imagine. They confuse stories with life. If this case truly rests on the shoulders of a toddler who still needs help tying her shoes, then I say to you, what does that say about the strength of the prosecution's case?" The jury listened, their faces unreadable. Meanwhile, Lily sat in a small waiting room, swinging her legs nervously as Rex lay beside her. She had no idea the storm she was about to step into. To her, it was just a room full of strangers. A big chair, and her dog friend, Rex. She didn't understand divided towns, heated debates, or what testimony meant. But she remembered the night. She remembered fear. And children, even at 3 years old, have a way of knowing when something is wrong. For now, the town waited. Families argued over dinner, papers ran bold headlines, and the courthouse filled each morning with faces eager for drama. Everyone agreed on one thing. Maplewood had never seen a case like this. And when Lily would take her seat before the jury, supported by Rex's steady presence, the entire town, whether believer or skeptic, would lean forward, hanging on the smallest voice in the room. The trial was no longer just about Thomas Greer. It was about trust, innocence, and whether truth could really come from the lips of a 3-year-old girl. The stage was set. The battle lines were drawn. And as the doors to the courtroom prepared to open for Lily's testimony, Maplewood held its breath. The heavy oak doors creaked open again, and the room fell silent as Lily was led inside. The atmosphere shifted, as though the air itself thickened with anticipation. Reporters froze mid-scribble. Jurors straightened in their seats. Even the judge leaned forward, his gaze softening at the sight of the tiny figure who had become the town's most debated presence. Lily's hand was wrapped tightly around her mother's fingers, her little stuffed bunny clutched under her arm. She wore the same pale yellow dress from the day before, chosen by her mother for its sunshine color, a reminder that her child was not here to be swallowed by shadows. But Lily looked overwhelmed. Her wide eyes scanned the cavernous room, taking in the rows of strangers, the wooden railings, and the towering judge's bench that made her feel smaller than she already was. Behind the rail, Thomas Greer sat stiffly. For the first time, he looked directly at her, and the briefest flicker of discomfort crossed his face. She looked back, her brow furrowing, before hiding her face against her mother's side. The prosecutor noted the exchange and filed it away in his mind, like an arrow ready to be drawn. Waiting near the witness stand was Rex. The German shepherd's ears perked the moment he saw her, his tail wagging gently against the floor. He stayed still, trained not to overwhelm, but his presence alone seemed to calm her trembling steps. Lily's grip loosened on her mother's hand as she inched toward the witness chair, her stuffed bunny now dragging slightly behind her. The bailiff, usually gruff and formal, crouched down to her level. "Would you like to sit in this chair, sweetheart?" His voice, softened for her sake, echoed through the hushed courtroom. She nodded, climbing awkwardly onto the large seat, her little legs dangling far above the floor. Rex padded over and lay at her side, resting his head on his paws, his body angled protectively toward her. The sight of the big dog and the tiny girl together drew a collective breath from the audience. The contrast was stark, but heartwarming innocence and loyalty side by side, in the middle of a storm no child should ever face. The judge cleared his throat, leaning slightly forward. "Good morning, Lily," he said gently. "Do you see Rex sitting next to you?" Lily's eyes lit up briefly, and she nodded. "Doggy," she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the room. The jury smiled, and a ripple of warmth spread through the tense air. Even the judge's stern features softened into a faint smile. "Yes," the judge said, nodding approvingly. "He's a very good dog. He's here to keep you company. You don't have to be scared, all right?" Lily gave a tiny nod, her thumb brushing against the ear of her stuffed bunny. Rex, sensing her calmness, edged closer and placed his chin gently on her lap. She giggled a small sound, fragile and pure, and for a fleeting moment, the gravity of the courtroom melted away. The prosecutor stood, careful to approach slowly, as though he were stepping into a child's world. His tone was calm, almost like a teacher coaxing a shy student. "Hi, Lily," he said with a kind smile. "Do you remember me? We played with blocks the other day." Her gaze flicked to him, and she gave a faint nod. "That's right," he said. "And you did such a good job stacking them higher than I could. You're very good at that." She smiled faintly, clutching her bunny tighter. Across the room, the defense attorney scoffed loudly. "Your Honor, is this playtime or a trial?" He snapped. "This is a mockery of due process." The judge's gavel struck once. "Enough, counselor. You will have your chance to speak. For now, let the child answer." The defense attorney sank back into his chair, but his smirk remained, as though confident the girl's words would collapse under their own weight. The prosecutor crouched slightly, his voice low and steady. "Lily, can you tell me who this is?" He pointed to Rex. Her hand stroked the dog's fur. "Doggy," she said again, more firmly this time. "And what's his name?" She paused, her brow furrowing as if pulling the memory from somewhere deep. "Rex," the prosecutor smiled. "That's right. Rex is your friend, isn't he?" Her nod was small but certain. Rex wagged his tail, a thump against the floor audible in the quiet room. The jury watched closely. Though the words were simple, each one carried weight. This child, so small and unsteady in her speech, was proving she could respond. She could understand. The skepticism that had filled the courtroom began to shift, if only slightly. The judge allowed the moment to linger before addressing the child himself. "Lily," he said softly, "do you know why you're here today?" Her head tilted, her small fingers twisting the bunny's worn ear. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Talk." A murmur spread across the room. She knew. In her own simple way, she understood. The prosecutor's heart pounded. He knew the next step was delicate. Too much pressure, and she would retreat into silence. Too little, and the jury would see her words as meaningless. He glanced at Rex, who remained steady, his calm presence radiating reassurance. He leaned forward. "That's right, Lily. You're here to talk. And Rex is here to help you. Can you tell us, who is that sitting over there?" He gestured toward the defendant. The defense attorney bolted upright. "Objection. Leading question." The judge raised a hand. "Sustained. Rephrase, counselor." The prosecutor swallowed, adjusting quickly. "Lily, do you see the man sitting at that table?" Her eyes turned slowly, hesitantly, toward the defense table. She stared at Thomas Greer, her small brow furrowing again. Then she looked back at Rex, burying her hand in his fur as though gathering courage. The room froze. The silence was so complete that even the ticking of the courtroom clock seemed loud. The jury leaned forward. The spectators stopped breathing. Even the defendant shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Lily opened her mouth. Her first true words were only a whisper, spoken into Rex's ear. But whatever she said made the handler's eyes widen, and the judge immediately leaned forward. The court hadn't yet heard the words, but they would soon. And when they did, no one in that room would forget the sound of truth, spoken in the smallest voice imaginable. The courtroom seemed to hang in suspension, as if the very air had stopped moving. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the little girl sitting in the oversized witness chair, her small hands tangled in the soft fur of the German shepherd beside her. Lily's lips had moved. She had whispered something into Rex's ear, something so faint that only his handler had heard. Officer Daniels, Rex's handler, looked startled. His brows arched slightly, and his lips parted as though he wasn't sure he had truly heard it. He glanced up at the judge, who caught the expression immediately. "Officer," the judge said firmly, though his voice was gentle for Lily's sake, "did the witness say something?" Daniels hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," he said carefully. "She spoke to Rex," she said. He paused, glancing at Lily with a look of compassion. She said, "Bad man." The words echoed in the stillness like a gunshot. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Jurors exchanged glances, their eyes widening. Reporters' pens scratched furiously against paper. A woman in the back row gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. The defense attorney was on his feet in an instant. "Objection, Your Honor." He barked, "This is hearsay. We cannot allow an officer to interpret the mumblings of a toddler into evidence." But before the judge could respond, Lily raised her head. Her eyes so wide, so impossibly innocent, locked on the man sitting at the defense table. With a trembling finger, she pointed at him. "Bad man," she repeated, louder this time. The words hung in the air like a blade. The defendant's face reddened, and for a brief second his mask of composure cracked. He shifted in his chair, avoiding her gaze. His lawyer quickly stepped forward, shielding him like a wall, but it was too late. The jury had seen it, the flicker of guilt, the discomfort at being named by a child too young to lie with calculation. The prosecutor didn't speak. He didn't need to. The moment was more powerful than any crafted argument he could have delivered. He let the silence work, let the words of a 3-year-old echo against the wood-paneled walls of the courtroom. The judge tapped his gavel once to quiet the growing whispers. His face betrayed nothing, but even he could not deny the weight of what had just unfolded. "Let the record show," he said steadily, "that the witness has identified the defendant with the words 'bad man.'" The defense attorney was livid. His voice rose with each sentence. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. We are treating a child's fragmented words as gospel. She doesn't understand the meaning of truth, of lies, of consequences. This is theater, not justice." But the judge's eyes were on Lily. She had turned back to Rex, her small fingers twisting the fur behind his ears, her body leaning into his solid frame. She wasn't smiling now. Her brow was furrowed, her mouth a tight line, the seriousness of her tiny voice still vibrating through the room. The prosecutor approached gently, his tone soft as if speaking to a skittish bird. "Lily," he said, kneeling so he was level with her, "you did a very brave thing. Can you tell us again who is the bad man?" Her finger rose again, unmistakable in its direction. She pointed directly at Thomas Greer. Her lips moved carefully this time, as though she wanted to make sure every person could hear her. "Him," she said. Gasps broke out again, the tension snapping like a taut rope. One juror pressed a hand to his chest, as though steadying his heartbeat. Another leaned forward, eyes fixed on the child who, in her broken speech, had done what no adult witness had managed. She had pierced the fog of uncertainty. Thomas Greer's lawyer slammed a hand on the table. "Objection. This is coercion. She's been primed, coached God knows what else." But Lily's voice rose again, stronger now that Rex's warm body anchored her. "He hurt," she said simply. Her tiny hand clutched her bunny tighter, but she didn't look away from the accused. Her words were imperfect, fragments of a memory she could not fully articulate. But the meaning was clear. The man she pointed to had caused harm. And in the honesty of a child's language, there was no space for embellishment or trickery. The prosecutor's throat tightened. He wanted to press further, to coax more from her, but he knew too well the danger of pushing too hard. The jury had heard enough. They didn't need eloquence. They needed truth. And truth had just been spoken in the simplest of forms. The judge leaned back in his chair, his hand brushing across his mouth as he considered the moment. In decades on the bench, he had seen experts unravel under questioning, seen seasoned witnesses falter, seen liars craft elaborate stories. But never had he seen such raw honesty, distilled into 2 words, land with the force of a hammer. "Court will recess for 15 minutes, the judge said finally, striking his gavel. "Jurors, remember your instructions. No discussion of testimony until deliberations." The room exploded with noise as people stood, whispering, shaking their heads, or scribbling frantic notes. Reporters bolted for the doors, eager to deliver the story that would make headlines by nightfall. Lily's mother rushed to her side, gathering her into her arms. The little girl buried her face against her mother's shoulder, her tiny body relaxing now that her part was over. Rex padded beside them, loyal and steady, his presence still radiating calm. The prosecutor stood quietly, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He knew the defense would tear at this moment, with every tool they had challenging, ridiculing, undermining. But the seed was planted. The jury had seen it, felt it. No cross-examination could erase the sight of a 3-year-old pointing across the room and naming a man, Bad. Thomas Greer sat rigid, his face pale now. His lawyer leaned close, whispering furiously, but Greer's eyes were fixed on the floor. For the first time since the trial began, he looked cornered. As Lily was led out, clutching her bunny and holding on to her mother's hand, the gallery's eyes followed her. She had said so little, just a handful of words. Yet those words carried more power than hours of testimony ever could. And though the case was far from over, the course of the trial had shifted. The smallest voice in the room had just spoken the loudest truth. When the courtroom reconvened after recess, there was a subtle but undeniable shift in the atmosphere. What had once felt like an uphill battle for the prosecution now had the weight of truth behind it, small, fragile, but undeniable. The jurors filed back into their seats, some glancing toward the witness stand, where Rex now lay curled up at Lily's feet like a guardian angel disguised in fur. The bailiff guided Lily and her mother back to the front. Though the child clung to her bunny with one arm, her other hand immediately reached down for Rex's ear, her fingers twisting through the tufts of hair. He lifted his head at her touch, eyes steady, body calm. It was as if the courtroom lights, the stares, the murmurs, all of it dissolved when she touched him. The prosecutor, aware of the delicacy of this moment, approached slowly. He wasn't just questioning a witness now. He was treading the thin line between protecting a traumatized child and asking her to carry the weight of justice. His voice was low, gentle. "Lily," he said softly, "you remember me, don't you?" She nodded faintly, her eyes down. "You said something very important before," he continued. "You told us about the bad man. You were very brave to do that." Her small body shifted uncomfortably in the chair. She squeezed Rex's ear harder, pressing her face into his side. The prosecutor waited. He had learned patience from years of dealing with delicate witnesses, but never had patience felt more critical. He let the silence sit, broken only by Rex's steady breathing. Then, almost as if the dog had given her strength, Lily turned her head and whispered again. "Bad man?" Hurt. Her mother's breath caught audibly, tears welling in her eyes. "Can you tell us what he hurt, Lily?" The prosecutor asked, his words wrapped in care. Her lips trembled, but she pressed her cheek into Rex's fur and whispered something again. Officer Daniels leaned in, straining to hear. She said, "Me." The courtroom stilled. Gasps echoed, and even the defense attorney froze for a second. The jurors sat rigid in their chairs, their attention locked on the small child, whose soft words carried the gravity of an earthquake. The prosecutor swallowed hard. He knew he couldn't push too far, couldn't force her into reliving what her young mind could barely process. But she had given them more, so much more. A direct connection. A bridge between her pain and the defendant's guilt. "Thank you, Lily," he whispered. "You are so strong." The defense attorney shot up from his chair, his face flushed. "Objection. This entire proceeding is prejudicial. This child doesn't know what she's saying. She's frightened, confused, influenced by that dog. We are building a case on the ramblings of a toddler and a canine's wagging tail." The judge lifted a hand, silencing the room. His voice was firm but calm. "Overruled. The witness has spoken. The jury will weigh the credibility of her words." The defense attorney fumed, but he knew the damage was already done. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. When the prosecutor gently ended his questioning, the defense seized the opportunity to cross-examine. He rose with forced calm, adjusting his tie as he approached the stand. His tone was falsely sweet, but his eyes were sharp. "Hello, Lily," he said. "I want to ask you a few simple questions, okay?" She didn't look at him. She pressed closer to Rex, burying her face in his fur. "Do you like dogs?" the attorney asked. A small nod. "And Rex is a very good dog, isn't he? Another nod, firmer this time. The attorney leaned forward. And if someone told you to say something to Rex, you would, wouldn't you? Even if it wasn't true? The gallery stirred, sensing the cruel undertone. The prosecutor rose. Objection badgering the witness. The judge warned, "Counselor, keep it appropriate." But the defense attorney smirked faintly and tried again, circling. "Lily, do you know what truth means?" She blinked at him. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Instead, she pressed her hand against Rex's fur, as though the answer might be found there. The attorney seized on her silence. "You see, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, turning dramatically, "this child cannot even define truth. Yet the prosecution expects you to accept her words as fact. This is not justice. This is manipulation." But before he could continue, something unexpected happened. Rex, sensing Lily's distress, shifted. He placed one massive paw across her lap, and Lily's hand automatically rested on it. The courtroom went still. The dog's gaze was fixed not on the defense attorney, not on the judge, but on Lily, as though anchoring her in this moment. And then, for the first time in the trial, Lily lifted her chin. Her voice trembled, but it carried. "Truth is." What happened? A hush fell over the room. The defense attorney froze, caught off guard. His lips pressed into a thin line as murmurs rose around him. He had tried to trap her, but instead she had spoken the purest definition of truth anyone in the room had ever heard. Her words weren't rehearsed. They weren't adult or polished. They were raw, unshaped, and heartbreakingly sincere. The judge leaned forward, his eyes heavy with gravity. "The witness has answered," he said firmly. The defense attorney, visibly shaken, mumbled something about no further questions and retreated to his seat. Lily sank back into the chair, leaning her full weight against Rex. Her bunny slipped from her lap, but Rex's paw remained steady and protective. She had done more than anyone expected. She had defined truth, not in a dictionary sense, but in a way that struck the soul. The jury looked different now. Some leaned forward, others scribbled notes, but all of them carried the same haunted expression. They weren't just hearing testimony anymore. They were witnessing courage, the kind that only comes from innocence and pain colliding. As court adjourned for the day, the press swarmed outside, their cameras flashing, their headlines already forming. Toddler defines truth in court. Police dog helps child testify. Jury shaken by 3-year-old's words. Inside, Lily was carried out in her mother's arms, Rex walking faithfully beside them. For her, it was over. She had spoken her truth. The rest no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the grown-ups, the lawyers, the jury, and the judge. But everyone who had heard her knew the case would never be the same. The smallest witness, with the biggest dog by her side, had spoken words that pierced through the walls of the courtroom and straight into the heart of justice. And as Rex padded out, tail low but steady, it was clear to everyone watching, he was not just a police dog. He was a silent hero. The next morning, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, their microphones raised like spears. Headlines from the previous day screamed across newspapers and screens. Child calls defendant bad man. Police dog calms young witness. Toddler defines truth in courtroom. But inside the courtroom, the mood was different. What had seemed like a crushing blow to the defense had become a rallying cry for them overnight. Thomas Greer's attorney, Martin Hall, strode in with fresh determination. He was seasoned, sharp, and known for dismantling witnesses with precision. To him, Lily's fragile words were nothing more than a weakness to exploit. The jury filed in, still visibly touched by the little girl's testimony. The prosecutor sat ready, confident but cautious. He knew the defense wouldn't let Lily's words sit unchallenged. Judge Whitaker opened the proceedings. "Mr. Hawley," he said, "you may continue with your case." Hawley rose, buttoning his tailored suit. His tone was calm, deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you witnessed yesterday was emotional, stirring. A child, innocent and wide-eyed, sitting with a loyal police dog, pointing a finger, uttering words no one could ignore." He paused, pacing slowly. "But emotion is not evidence. Sentiment is not fact. And justice, ladies and gentlemen, cannot be built on sympathy." The prosecutor shifted uneasily. Hawley had a talent for reframing truth into doubt. Hawley continued, turning toward the jury with piercing eyes. "This child is 3 years old. 3. Do you remember your own children at that age? Niece, nephew, grandchild? Could they even string together reliable sentences? Could they distinguish dreams from reality? Truth from imagination? Or were they parroting what adults wanted them to say?" He leaned forward on the jury box rail, lowering his voice. "Ask yourselves, would you put a man's life and freedom in the hands of a toddler who still needs a stuffed rabbit to feel safe?" The jurors exchanged uneasy glances. His words were cutting, calculated to seed doubt. "Furthermore," Hawley pressed on, "let us discuss Rex, a magnificent dog, no doubt. But ladies and gentlemen, he is not a translator of truth. He cannot tell us what the child means. Yet his very presence manipulates your emotions. Who among you did not feel your heart soften when you saw that child nestle into his fur? Who did not think, this must be true because she feels safe? That, ladies and gentlemen, is not evidence. That is theater." The gallery buzzed, whispers sparking across the benches. The prosecutor leapt to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is testifying, not arguing." The judge frowned. "Sustained. Mr. Hawley, keep your remarks within the bounds of evidence." Hawley nodded, feigning humility. "Of course, Your Honor." He turned back. "And let us address evidence. Where is it? Where are the medical records, the photographs, the statements made at the time? We are told to rely on the broken words of a toddler, interpreted through the sympathetic ears of adults. And yet, yesterday, when asked the meaning of truth, she gave us a child's definition. Lovely, yes. Poetic even. But admissible? Reliable? No. The defense attorney's voice grew stronger, sharper. This trial must not become a stage play starring a child and her dog. If we allow emotion to dictate guilt, we betray justice itself. My client deserves the same protection of law as any citizen, no matter how compelling a performance may seem. Thomas Greer sat stiff beside him, his face pale but mask-like, hands folded tightly. The jurors were listening closely, weighing every word. Some nodded faintly. The spell of Lily's testimony was being tested under the harsh light of doubt. When Hawley finished, the prosecutor rose. He knew the defense had scored points, but he also knew there was a truth Hawley couldn't scrub away. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "you heard Mr. Hawley argue that this child is too young, too fragile, too imaginative. But let me ask you this. What motive could she possibly have? What 3-year-old sits in a courtroom, trembling, clinging to a dog, and invents a story about a man she barely knows? She did not come here to perform. She came here because truth, in her small way, demanded to be spoken." He let his words hang before adding, "And when she said, 'bad man,' when she said, 'hurt me,' those were not rehearsed lines. Those were fragments of memory, too real to vanish. A child does not need perfect vocabulary to tell the truth. Sometimes simplicity speaks louder than complexity." Hawley objected. "Speculation." "Overruled," said the judge. The prosecutor pressed forward. "And let us not ignore the defendant's own reaction. Did you see him, ladies and gentlemen, when she pointed at him? Did you see the flicker of panic, the mask crack? Children may lack adult polish, but they possess something adults often lose: instinct. She knew. She remembered. And you saw it too. The jurors' faces shifted again. Doubt lingered, but so did memory. Still, Halle wasn't finished. After the break, he called his own expert witness, a child psychologist. Dr. Lanning, gray-haired and authoritative, took the stand. "Doctor," Halle began, "at what age can children reliably distinguish between truth and imagination?" "Typically, around age 4 to 5, the doctor answered. "At 3, children often blur reality with fantasy. They may repeat things told to them, sincerely believing them to be true." Halle nodded solemnly. "So in your professional opinion, is a 3-year-old's courtroom testimony reliable?" The doctor hesitated. "It depends." "Often no." Halle turned to the jury. "There you have it. Science. Professional testimony. Not sympathy, not a stuffed rabbit, not a dog's paw, but evidence." The prosecutor cross-examined, pointing out that children also show truth through consistent patterns and instinctive reactions. But the seed of doubt had been planted. By the day's end, the jury looked weighed down, torn between what they had felt from Lily and what they were now told to believe. As the court adjourned, Lily left with her mother and Rex, unaware of the storm swirling around her testimony. To her, she had already done the hardest thing. She had spoken. The rest was noise she could not understand. But for the lawyers, for the judge, and for the jurors, the battle was now at its fiercest. The defense had struck back with all its might. And though Lily's words still echoed in the air, their clarity was now clouded by strategy, science, and doubt. The smallest voice in the room had shaken the walls of justice. But could it withstand the storm the defense had unleashed? The courthouse buzzed with tension on the morning of the 7th day. The defense's counterattack had left its mark. Jurors walked in carrying the heavy weight of doubt, their expressions unreadable. The gallery whispered of turning tides, of science versus instinct, of justice teetering on a child's fragile words. But the prosecutor had been preparing for this moment. He knew emotion alone would not win. He needed proof that spoke as clearly as Lily's trembling finger and Rex's steady presence. And that morning, he carried it in a stack of carefully guarded folders. As the judge took his seat, the prosecutor rose. "Your Honor, the state would like to introduce new evidence." The defense attorney, Halle, stiffened immediately. "Objection. This is trial by ambush." The judge frowned. "Mr. Green, explain." The prosecutor held up the folders. These materials were disclosed during discovery, but not yet presented. In light of the defense's attempt to undermine the testimony of our youngest witness, it is vital the jury sees this. Halle sputtered, but the judge waved him down. "Proceed, Mr. Green." The prosecutor stepped to the center of the courtroom. He opened the first folder and held up a photograph. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is from the night Lily was brought into the hospital emergency room. The attending physician documented bruises consistent with forceful handling on her arms, her back, and her legs. These were not playground scrapes. They were not accidents." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The jurors leaned forward, eyes locking onto the images displayed on the projector. Purple blotches. Small handprints. Too precise, too cruel. The prosecutor's voice grew firmer. "Now, the defense asked yesterday, where is the evidence? Here it is, the medical report from that night." The words of the child were not conjured from imagination. They were etched into her skin. Halle sprang to his feet. "Objection. Inflammatory. These injuries could have been caused by anything. Children fall." "Overruled," Judge Whitaker said, his voice sharp. "The jury will consider the evidence." The prosecutor moved on, his momentum unstoppable. He called the ER doctor to the stand. A calm, steady woman with 30 years of pediatric experience. "Doctor," the prosecutor asked, "in your medical opinion, were these injuries accidental?" The doctor shook her head. "No, the bruises were patterned, deliberate. This was not a fall. It was inflicted." The jury scribbled furiously. Halle cross-examined, throwing out wild theories about playground accidents and roughhousing, but the doctor stood firm. "I've treated hundreds of children," she said evenly. "I know the difference between a fall and abuse. This child was harmed." The prosecution wasn't done. He called Officer Daniels, Rex's handler, back to the stand. Daniels had been the one to first interact with Lily when she was rescued. "Officer," the prosecutor began, "can you describe Lily's condition that night?" Daniels' face hardened. She was terrified. She wouldn't let go of her stuffed bunny. She wouldn't speak to anyone. But when Rex approached her, she touched him. And for the first time, she whispered 2 words, "Bad man." The jurors' heads snapped up. Those words had haunted them since Lily spoke them in court. Now they learned she had said them before, unprompted, uncoached, on the very night of the incident. Halle jumped up again. "Objection. Hearsay." But the judge shook his head. "Overruled. This testimony corroborates the child's spontaneous statement." The prosecutor let it sink in. "Ladies and gentlemen, you heard the defense argue that Lily's words were influenced, coached, manipulated. But here you have proof. The very first time she opened her mouth after the incident, she said the same thing she said in this courtroom. Bad man, 3 years old. No prompting. Just truth." Halle tried to cut in, but the prosecutor pressed further. He flipped open another folder. And there is more. Cell phone records. The defendant's phone placed him within 3 blocks of Lily's home on the night of the incident, despite his sworn alibi that he was across town. A hush fell. Hale's jaw tightened. "Location data," the prosecutor said, holding up the records. "Science, not sentiment. Fact, not imagination." The defense scrambled. Halle rose, voice shaking with urgency. "Cell towers are imprecise. They don't pinpoint exact addresses." The prosecutor's eyes locked on him. "But they place him nearer. Near enough. Nearer than he admitted." The jurors exchanged looks now, the pieces shifting in their minds. Lily's words. The bruises. The doctor's certainty. The cell phone evidence. It was no longer a story told by a child. It was a story supported by proof. Halle attempted to recover by calling another expert witness, a psychologist who specialized in child memory. He argued that children at Lily's age often create false memories, especially after questioning by authority figures. But the prosecutor was ready. On cross-examination, he asked, "Doctor, can false memories create physical bruises?" The psychologist faltered. "No." "Can false memories alter cell phone records?" "No." "Then no matter what you say about imagination, the evidence still stands, doesn't it?" The doctor shifted uncomfortably. "Yes." The courtroom buzzed with energy. Halle had been cornered. The prosecutor returned to the jury, his voice steady but resonant. "Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday you were asked to doubt the words of a child. Today, you have seen that her words match the facts. She said, 'Bad man,' and now you know why. Because she bore the marks. Because she spoke those same words on the night it happened. Because the defendant was there when he swore he wasn't. That is not fantasy. That is truth." The jurors sat in silence, their pens still, their faces grave. When court adjourned that day, the gallery erupted in murmurs. The press raced for the doors. Headlines were already forming again. Evidence corroborates toddler's testimony. Medical records reveal bruises. Defendant's alibi crumbles. Lily. oblivious to the storm, was carried out in her mother's arms, Rex padding faithfully by her side. She had no idea that her tiny voice, paired with undeniable proof, had turned the tide once more. And as the sun dipped behind the courthouse, one truth became clear. The smallest witness had been vindicated. The defense's wall of doubt had cracked. And now, justice was beginning to shine through. The tension in the courtroom was palpable on the final day of the trial. Every seat was filled. Cameras trained on the solemn faces of the jury, the defendant, the lawyers, and the little girl who had become the center of the storm. Outside, the town of Maplewood waited in anxious silence, hanging on every news update and whispered rumor. For days, the town had been divided, its people arguing over innocence and doubt. Now, all eyes were on a single moment, the moment the jury would deliver justice. Lily sat in her mother's lap at the front of the courtroom, her tiny hands clutching her bunny. Rex lay at her feet, his large body stretched out protectively, his ears flicking at every sound. The prosecutor glanced at her with a small nod, a silent message of encouragement. She had already done more than anyone could have imagined, but her presence now added weight to the moment. She was the witness, the spark of truth, the living proof of what had happened that night. Thomas Greer sat stiffly beside his attorney, his face pale and taut, the calm mask of his courtroom persona slipping as the jury returned. Halle whispered urgently to him, but Greer's eyes remained fixed ahead, betraying fear and anticipation in equal measure. Judge Whitaker rose as the jury entered. The room fell silent. Every heartbeat seemed amplified, every rustle of paper audible. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a lined face and calm eyes, handed the verdict slip to the bailiff. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied. She rose, taking a deep breath. "We have." The judge nodded. "Please hand the verdict to the clerk to read aloud." The clerk unfolded the paper, clearing her throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Greer, guilty of assault." The courtroom erupted. Some gasped audibly, some wept quietly, and some simply sat frozen, absorbing the magnitude of what had just been announced. The defense attorney staggered back into his chair, disbelief etched into his face. Greer's lips trembled, his hands tightening into fists, before finally dropping helplessly to his sides. The prosecutor allowed himself a brief exhale. Justice had been served, but it was not a victory born of theatrics. It was truth, painstakingly uncovered, courageously spoken by the smallest witness in the room. Judge Whitaker struck his gavel. "Order in the court," he said firmly. Then softer, he addressed the little girl. "Lily, you have been incredibly brave. You helped everyone here understand what happened. Your courage has made a difference." Lily blinked, her small lips curling into the faintest smile. She reached for Rex, who nudged her hand gently with his nose. The bond between them had been more than comfort. It had been strength, a bridge allowing her voice to be heard when words alone might have failed. Her mother's eyes were wet, tears streaking her cheeks. She gathered Lily in her arms, holding her close, whispering thanks to her for being so strong. The courtroom seemed to soften around them, the air itself lighter now that the ordeal was over. Outside, the town reacted in waves. Maplewood's residents, previously divided, now shared a collective sense of relief and vindication. The local diner, the church, even the high school had people discussing the trial, the courage of a 3-year-old, and the undeniable impact of honesty. Many were moved, not just by the verdict, but by the child's bravery and the steadfast presence of Rex, the silent hero. The press captured every moment, and the story spread rapidly, reaching beyond the small town to regional and national outlets. Headlines celebrated the child's courage, the dog's calming presence, And the victory of truth. 3-year-old testifies with police dog by her side, brings justice and tiny voice. Big impact. Lily helps convict abuser. But beyond the headlines, there was healing. The babysitter, who had endured the night of terror, was able to leave the courtroom with a sense of closure. She thanked Lily and her mother personally, tears mingling with relief. The local police department praised Rex and Officer Daniels for their sensitive handling of a situation far beyond routine duty. For Lily, life would slowly return to normal. Days of court, lights, cameras, and strangers had been exhausting, but she had been strong. Her mother vowed to protect her, to let her childhood continue without the weight of the past hanging over her every step. Rex would remain by her side, not just as a police dog, but as a companion who had been with her through something extraordinary. The case became a touchstone for the community. Town meetings discussed ways to better protect children. Schools implemented programs on speaking out safely, and the courthouse became a symbol of hope rather than fear. People who had argued over the trial found common ground in their shared respect for Lily's courage. As for Thomas Greer, he was taken into custody, his life forever changed by the words of a 3-year-old and the evidence that supported them. He had been afforded due process, but truth had prevailed. His actions could no longer be denied, hidden, or dismissed. And in the quiet moments after the trial, when the courthouse emptied and the noise faded, Lily sat in the back seat of her mother's car, Rex curled beside her. Her tiny hand stroked his fur, and she whispered, almost to herself, "Good dog." Rex wagged his tail, resting his head on her lap. He didn't need words. They had shared an unspoken understanding. Courage sometimes comes in the smallest of packages, and truth always finds a way to be heard, no matter the obstacles. The town of Maplewood would remember this day for years to come. A 3-year-old girl, barely able to speak, had changed the course of a trial, inspired a community, and reminded everyone that bravery and honesty are not measured in size or age. Justice had been served, yes, but more importantly, hope had been restored. And for Lily, her family, and the quiet hero named Rex, life could finally begin again, marked by the courage they had shown, the truth they had spoken, and the bonds they had formed in the face of fear. The sun set over Maplewood, warm and golden, as if blessing the small victories of a day that had started with uncertainty and ended in clarity. The echoes of tiny words, whispered with fear but full of honesty, would never be forgotten. And somewhere in the quiet of the house, Lily played with her blocks, Rex at her side, both of them heroes in their own way, teaching the world that even the smallest voices can create the biggest change.